Hey everybody, in today's video we're going to be taking a first look at the Nikon Z50II. This is the newest addition to the DX line of cameras in the Nikon Z system, and we haven't had a DX camera for quite a while, the last being the Z30, and then before that we had the ZFC. This is going to be a direct replacement to the Z50. It's not necessarily a new line of camera. It's not a mythical Z70 or Z90 or anything like that. This is a Z52, and therefore it carries a lot of things that are similar, and it also carries a lot of things that are new. We'll go through the things that I like and the things that I don't like. There are some interesting aspects of this camera, and we'll talk about those, and we'll go through what I've discovered having shot with this over the past couple of months. So first of all, what's changed? Let's talk about the outside of the camera. Notably, the Z52 is considerably larger than the original Z50. It's quite noticeable in the fact that it's chunkier in pretty much every aspect. It's taller, it's thicker, quite notably thicker, the body's a lot thicker, partly due to the fact it has a different screen on the back of the camera and a different hinge there, but also ergonomically, the grip is also a lot more comfortable than the previous grip. The Z50's grip was never bad. The Z52's grip definitely feels a lot more substantial in the hand, and it's much easier for me to kind of make sure that I'm holding the grip properly without it feeling like it's too small in the palm of my hand. So ergonomically, it's changed quite a bit. It's quite a bit bigger, and also it's a little bit heavier. When you compare it to other cameras, it is still smaller than the full frame equivalents, so still smaller than the ZF and still smaller than, say, a Z6II or a Z6III, for example, but it is noticeably chunkier when you compare it directly to a Z50. So just keep that in mind if you're coming from the original Z50, the camera is going to be noticeably chunkier. A couple of other changes on the back of the camera, button layouts, and also a couple of new buttons and new features on the outside of the camera. We now have a dedicated picture control button. Picture controls have been something that have been available in Nikon cameras forever, but you now have the ability to change those picture controls from a dedicated picture control button. On previous cameras, you could have added picture controls to a button if you wanted to, but Nikon have decided that in the Z52, the picture controls are so important that they'll have their own dedicated button. This is going to be useful for those of you that want to change the profile that you're shooting in camera for stills, and more importantly for video. For those of you that just want to shoot video in camera and then not do any editing in post or any grading, and you just want the video to look like your style straight out of camera, then using a picture control while shooting video is really going to help you with that. More importantly, because the Z52 also connects to the Nikon Cloud service, you can download picture controls from other Nikon creators. So if there's a particular picture control that you like the look of, or if there's a creator that has a look that you like the look of, and they have that uploaded to the Nikon Cloud system, you can download that, or you can create your own using the Nikon Cloud system and download that directly to your camera as well. So picture controls have taken a bit of a bump into how useful they are. It's really going to be there for beginners, enthusiasts, and for people who just want the flexibility of changing the look of their images and the video in camera without doing any external editing or any editing in post. When it comes to the other changes on the back of the camera, the one I mentioned earlier is the flip out screen. So this is a fully articulating flip out screen that will rotate all the way around and then all the way above below. Really useful if you want to shoot above a crowd. So if you're trying to shoot kind of above a crowd and you're struggling to see your screen, or if you want to shoot nice and low, really useful for that as well. And then obviously if you want to take pictures of yourself or record video of yourself, that's where that articulating screen becomes very useful. I appreciate that this screen is not necessarily the best screen to have from a photography point of view. I'd much prefer that kind of traditional tilt screen that you have on, say, the Z8 or the Z9 from a photography point of view. But from a video point of view, or from someone that's using this camera to record themselves, being able to just see themselves in front of the camera is really important. The downside is that the ports are still on the same side that the screen rotates. It would have been nice to have the ports on the other side of the camera, so that then you don't have any cables or microphone cables or any USB charging cables plugged in that then cover the screen. So that's still something to keep in mind, but it does have a fully articulated screen, which is completely different to the screen that was on the original Z50, which flipped down, and that caused any problems as soon as you wanted to tripod mount the camera. So it worked if you were holding it handheld, but as soon as you tripod mounted it, then obviously everything was kind of in the way, unless you had a dedicated bracket. One other change that's been made is to the viewfinder. The viewfinder is still the same resolution, But like the new viewfinder in the Z6 III and also the viewfinder in the Z8 and the Z9, it is significantly brighter. Nikon's been on this kind of wave of increasing brightness to its viewfinders to make them easier to use in difficult lighting situations, whether it's very bright lighting conditions or very dark lighting conditions. Double the brightness in your viewfinder on the Z52 versus the old Z50. Same resolution, but double the brightness. As I've talked about in other camera videos, I think the brightness of a viewfinder is something that is massively overlooked, and I cannot tell you how useful that brighter viewfinder is in bright sunny conditions for things like wildlife, for things like sports. If you're dealing with a bright outdoor light and your viewfinder just doesn't look as bright as the outdoors, it just doesn't help you in any way. So having a bright viewfinder really makes a huge difference. One other small adjustment to the viewfinder as well is how the viewfinder cover works. So on the previous Z50, the viewfinder extended quite a bit out the back of the camera, and that was quite obtrusive. It was either push against glasses, or it would get in the way if you were trying to tripod mount it or if you're trying to use it on a gimbal. And one of the other big problems is that that viewfinder cover was removable and it could be easily or accidentally popped off and lost. And so one of the things that is really interesting, because this is the first time we've seen this on any Nikon camera, is that the viewfinder cover is now fixed in place. It's physically fixed in place with 2 screws. So if you wanted to replace it, you'd have to physically unscrew it and then replace the viewfinder cover unit as a part, effectively. So that is interesting, and definitely interesting to see if we see that in other cameras going forward. I know there's lots of you out there with Z6II and Z7II and the original Z6 and Z7 that have probably lost your viewfinder cover. So if that is the case, it'd be interesting to see if that does make its way into other Nikon cameras. So this viewfinder cover is fully attached. You cannot pop it off. Z52 also still has an inbuilt flash. It's one of the only cameras in the range that still has an inbuilt flash. So if that's important to you, the Z52 is really the only choice that you have. New addition of a red recording light on the front of the camera. So when it's recording, it will tell you via that light, or if you're using the screen flipped towards you, you'll also get a red record border around the front of the screen as well. Now, when it comes to batteries and memory cards, you'll still find the battery and the memory card in the same door on the bottom of the camera. And when it comes to batteries, it will still take the ENEL25. There is a newer ENEL25A, which has a slightly higher capacity. And compared to the older battery that came with the Z50, which was just the ENEL25, they are interchangeable. But if you're buying a new battery, or if you want second batteries, then I'd always go for the ENEL25A. Because of that slightly higher capacity, just going to give you slightly higher, better battery life. So when it comes to what's inside the new Z52, first of all, the sensor is the same 20 megapixel DX sized sensor that we've come to know from Nikon. Yes, it would have been really nice to see a new DX size sensor. We've had this 20 megapixel DX sensor for a long time. Now, don't get me wrong, it's an incredibly good DX sensor. One of the best that Nikon's ever made. In the D500, it's legendary. So it is a legendary sensor, but given the amount of time that's been between the sensor being used for the first time and then still being used subsequently, it would have been nice to either add in some new technology or even just to add in a higher resolution bump. We can't change that. It is what it is. So yeah, it's still the same 20 megapixel sensor, but still, in most cases, that generates a wonderful image and a wonderful quality of image that people still really like and still really love. So there are some benefits to that sensor. No one's ever said to me that the 20 megapixel DX sensor is really bad. CMOS sensors, it's not as new as some of the new semi-stacked or fully stacked CMOS sensors. But then I guess they would have also meant that the camera would have been more expensive. So price point also then plays a part in that. So what is new? Well, most of the new adjustments and changes are all based around the Expeed 7 processor. So the Z52 now makes use of the Expeed 7 processor that first started in the Nikon Z9, made its way then into other cameras, the Z8, the ZF, and also then into the Z6 III. So that Expeed 7 processor really brings in a lot of adjustments and a lot of improvements. Firstly, around speed, we get faster frame rates. We also then get faster just all-round use and usage, whether it's going from the menu to turning on, the power up time has been improved by half. So whereas with the Z50 it took a second for the camera to start up and be working, the Z52 starts up in half a second. So all round just improvements in terms of usage of the camera and speed of the camera thanks to Expeed 7. You also then have significant improvements when it comes to autofocus. This camera now also has 3D tracking. It has all of the custom areas, so if you want to customize and make your own size and shape. And it also has all of the same subject detection options from the Z9. So that means that you can use the subject detection for animals, people, vehicles, birds, which even the Z6 III doesn't have yet, which is interesting. So this is actually a really good little camera because of the Expeed 7 processor, really. In terms of the subject detection, how that performs, I've been pretty impressed with it. In terms of its ability to hold and track and keep a subject in focus, it's actually pretty impressive for a small, lightweight camera without a very fast sensor. So it is able to track and follow a bird in flight and works really well. I've got a couple of examples that you'll be looking at now as to how the camera's kind of tracking a bird in flight as it's flying towards you. Is it going to be as good as a faster readout censored camera, like a stacked sensor or like the partially stacked sensor that you get in a Z6 III, for example? Well, there's always going to be a limitation as to how quickly the data can be read off of a sensor and then processed by your processor. The faster that autofocusing data can be read off a sensor and delivered to your processor, the better. But the processor is still allowing the camera to focus as fast as it can and to track and keep most moving subjects in focus. It's considerably better than the autofocus that you had on the Z50, and the Z50's autofocus wasn't bad. So it's an all-round improvement, and then alongside those new autofocusing areas like 3D and the custom areas, it's just a vastly improved autofocusing system. You also then get access to pre-release capture, so the Z50 can shoot pre-release capture at either 15 or 30 frames per second. That allows you to capture the movement of a subject before it even happens. So let's say you're waiting for a subject to start running, or you're waiting for a bird to take off. In those circumstances, you might miss the action, or you might press your shutter button just as the subject starts moving. And so with pre-release, you either half press the shutter button or you use an AF on button to activate your autofocus. That then rolls the pre-release and the camera is actually taking pictures at that point, but it doesn't save them until you then fully press your shutter button when you want the camera to shoot. When you fully press the shutter button, you then get 1 second's worth of images prior to you pressing that shutter button. So hence that kind of pre-release capture ability. A lot of cameras have this now. It's not necessarily new. A lot of Nikon cameras have this and other cameras as well, but it is a very useful feature. On this camera, the key thing to note about pre-release is that it will still only allow you to shoot in JPEG. It will not allow you to use pre-release in RAW. That is probably the biggest request that I have, to add RAW pre-release to existing cameras or to new cameras. And when Nikon can finally do that, that's when that'll be a really useful thing for me to use. But right now I just don't use pre-release capture because of the JPEG aspect. But as long as you're okay with the JPEGs, then pre-release works really nicely. You also get the new RAW formats, so the new high efficiency RAW formats that have existed in the Z8, the Z9, Z6 III, ZF for a long time are now brought down into the Z52. Pretty much everything that's kind of been added new with the new generation of cameras has been put into this camera, which is really nice. There's also vast improvements to customization. When it comes to customizing buttons and the function buttons on the inside of the grip, with the previous camera, the Z50 always lacked options to customize. You couldn't set a specific autofocusing area to a button, for example. Whereas with the Z52, you've got all the equivalent customization that you do on the Z8 and the Z9. You can use cycle AF area, which is one of my favorites on my Z8, where you can cycle through your favorite autofocusing areas, or you can just load in a specific autofocusing area into a function button. So you press a function button, it allows you to quickly switch to that focusing area, you let go and it switches back. The only real thing it doesn't have that you can customize to buttons in other cameras is recall shooting functions, which is fair. In terms of most of the customization options, you'll find that the full suite of customization options are available on this camera, despite it being a smaller, lighter camera. I've also got some tests around the buffer, and I'll show you some examples of the buffer rates when using that SD card slot. That SD card slot is also a UHS 2 card slot. When it comes to video, this is where the Z50II really steps up from the previous Z50. It includes a lot of the improvements that we've seen across the board with other previous Nikon Z series cameras, and really shows that Nikon is going into video pretty heavily. The Z52 can shoot up to 4K at 60 frames per second, but that does apply a 1.5 times crop on top of the already existing DX crop, so just be aware of that. You can then record 4K at 30 frames per second. That 4K at 30 frames per second will be super sampled from a 5.6K, which will give you a much more detailed and cleaner video output. And then you also can still shoot 120 frames per second, and that 120 frames per second is going to be at full HD at 1080. And one of the major addition to video is the inclusion of N-Log and the ability to record in 10-bit. For a camera of this size and for a camera of this price point, I think that's pretty impressive. What you're able to do is change the bit depth from 8 to 10-bit, and in previous cameras like the Z50, you were only able to shoot in 8-bit. You can then choose that N-Log and shoot that log profile and then color grade that in post. That also means that you could make use of the new red LUTs that have been made for Nikon N-Log and use them if you wanted to color grade or adjust any of the footage that you're shooting on the Z52. So in terms of video recording, getting the best quality out of the camera, this is the smallest camera that Nikon makes that will let you shoot 4K in 10-bit with log and then color grade in post. For people who want something that's small, lightweight, and still a large sensor for video, that's pretty impressive. Now, there's also going to be a new product view mode, and I just wanted to show you what that product view mode looks like from actually filming on the camera. So what we'll do at this point is we'll switch over to the Z52 and I'll show you what that product view mode does, because that is something that I do quite a lot. And if I'm using a camera that doesn't have product view like the Z8, what I have to try and do is block the camera's view of me so it doesn't focus on my eyes or my faces, and it works quite well. But what if I wanted to show the product and my face at the same time? Then generally in this circumstance here, this product isn't going to be in focus and my face will be in focus. So I'll just show you what that looks like on the Z50, so we'll switch over to that. Okay, so this is product review mode currently turned off, and as I mentioned, I have to physically hold something in front of my eyes or my face for the camera to focus on it. So if I hold it here, it's not going to focus on it, and this camera is no longer in focus at the moment. It's still holding focus here. What I'd normally have to do is I'd have to cover my eyes and my face from the camera, so then it will shift focus to the subject, and then when I bring that back down, it'll jump back to my eyes. Let's have a look, see what product review mode does and see if that's any different. When I bring this product up and wherever I hold it in the frame, so even if I hold it here, that should be the point of focus. So it should automatically just be focusing on that as the closest subject to you. And I'm obviously not having to block my face or my eyes here. So that should work quite nicely. And then as soon as I bring that back here, I should just be back to being in focus as normal. And then bring this back and I can hold that anywhere in the frame, and that will be kind of the main priority. I don't have to cover my eyes like I did previously, so works quite nicely, hopefully. Now, when it comes to lenses and the Z52, because it's a DX size camera, you have the native DX lenses, but you can also make use of the full frame lenses and also make use of the f-mount lenses via an FTZ adapter if you wanted to. A couple of my favorite lenses I've been using on the Z52 are the 12 to 28 and also the 24 1.7 DX lens. The 12 to 28 is a really nice wide angle, and the 24 1.7 is just a really nice prime. But I also been using some of the full frame lenses, so the 135, also the 28mm 2.8, the 40mm f2, and this 400mm 4.5. So as I mentioned, even with the grip and some of the longer lenses, it actually handles really nicely even with those long lenses. So if you did want to use this for wildlife and make use of the effective focal length or effective crop, that's actually quite a nice setup to take a 400mm focal length lens, put a DX camera on the back of it, and then that obviously gives you a 600mm effective focal length. So that is actually a really nice lightweight, doesn't really weigh anything at all. I could walk around and shoot with that all day. But it doesn't have to be this 400 4.5. You could go to the 600. You could do a 100 to 400, the 180 to 600, although the 180 to 600 is a bit longer and a bit heavier. But because of that grip, you can actually have good control of the lens. And as long as you've got your left hand in there as well, then it's evenly balanced. So actually works quite nicely for those of you who do want to use this and make use of that DX crop on longer lenses. Now, alongside the Z50II, Nikon's also announcing a new cabled remote. So this is the new MC-DC3. This is exactly what it is. It's a cabled remote. So it has a half press for autofocus, and then you have a full press to take the shot, and you also have a push and hold, useful if you want to use it for long exposures. This is going to be based on plugging into your headphone jack of the Z52. And the Z52 also has a dedicated control for this, where you can change the headphone jack from a remote to a headphone port, so it's up to you how you want that to work. Currently, this headphone jack based remote does not work with any other Z series camera. It's just Z52. I've tried it on all the other cameras and none of them work. So I would imagine that this is either something that would need to have a firmware update to be able to work, or it would only work with cameras going forward. So we'll wait and see what happens there. But if you are interested in a cabled remote and you don't want to use a wireless remote or a Bluetooth remote, then the DC3 is a new remote that's launching with the Z52. So just keep that in mind. But really straightforward. There's not too much to say about the remote. The improvements are clear. For those of you that are Z50 users, upgrading to a Z52 will give you significant improvements in autofocus and give you lots of additional features when it comes to new options, new settings, new customization, improved viewfinder, improved ergonomics, and so on. As I mentioned, it is a bit of a shame that we're not seeing a new sensor. I would have loved to have had a higher resolution bump or a faster readout sensor. The readout of this sensor means that I wouldn't advise using this sensor in an electronic shutter mode when dealing with sports or with wildlife, because you will still get distortion and you will still see that kind of rolling shutter effect just because of the readout of the sensor. Obviously, a lot of cameras now have much faster readout sensors like the Z6 III, the Z8, the Z9, but they're also a lot more expensive. So I do truly believe that if it was a resolution bump or a faster readout sensor, then the price would have increased beyond its segment. What do I think this camera is going to be really good for? I think it's going to be really good for someone that is equally interested in stills and video, or maybe even more interested in video than stills because of how good the video is in such a small, lightweight camera. 10-bit 4K in a small, lightweight camera that you can easily record yourself works quite nicely, and you can obviously change the lenses as well, which is a great setup to have. It's a nice little vlogging camera, effectively. I think it's also going to be good for people who want a small, lightweight camera for travel, for documenting as they're exploring, for people who are interested in landscapes, architecture, cityscapes, seascapes, all that type of stuff. It's going to be fantastic for. It's going to be really good for wildlife and sports, thanks to the new autofocusing system, the new subject detection options, but I would not use it in sports and wildlife in silent or with the electronic shutter. I would stick to the mechanical shutter to make sure you get a fast enough readout that doesn't give you any distortion. I certainly hope that you found this first look at the Z52 useful. It's going to be a really small, lightweight, easy camera to carry. For those of you that already have a main body and you just want something smaller that's Z mount to put in your pocket, this is perfect for that. If you want something that is going to be your main camera but improvements upon what you already have, then the Expeed 7 processor just really allows you to improve on all things around the camera in terms of startup time, just usage of how quick the camera is to use, and also, as I mentioned, autofocus and so on. All right, well, I hope that you found everything that we've gone through today useful. If you have any questions about the Z52, or if there's anything that I've missed, then please do let me know in the comments below. Thank you all so much for watching. Goodbye.